all panelists, my colleagues, my friends who has been working together for in the last couple of years. And thank you for the participants for registering and joining this event. I would like to start with my slide. Krishna, could you please share the screen and full screen, please? Okay, so in case you are not sure what side event are you on, this side event is titled Reducing Mercury Use in SGM in Indonesia, Implementing Local Action Plans to Address Storage, Trade, and Monitoring. This event is a joint, multi-year joint project between Nexus 3, Biodiversity Research Institute, IPEN, GI Talks, and CRPG, the Center for Research and Policy and Regulations, with the support of funding from the US Department of State, and for monitoring, we were supported by the World Bank. Today's speakers will be consisted of Ibu Yun Insiani from the Ministry of Environment that will deliver her opening remarks from a recorded video, and then continued with Diah Paramita from Center for Regulation, Policy and Governance, and then followed by Libel from IPEN, and then Dave Evers from BRI. We will have two interpreters in the chat box for Indonesia. From English to Bahasa Indonesia will be done by Eric. Thank you, Eric, for joining this evening. And for English to Spanish will be done by Carmen Capriles from Bolivia. Thank you so much for joining tonight, Carmen. Next slide, please. So for this project, I just want to introduce quickly and briefly. This project is consisted of 4 components. The first component is on policy and regulations, assisting the development of national and local action plans to include restrict mercury supplies from primary mining and also restrict mercury byproducts from oil and gas. The next slide, please. Yeah, and the second component is assisting the development of local action plans and policy recommendations to monitor mercury supplies and trade and provide capacity buildings for stakeholders. Component 3 of this project is developing recommendations for mercury storage, especially for confiscated mercury and mercury waste. And component 4 is mercury monitoring, and developing strategy and recommendations for mercury monitoring in ASGM hotspots especially, but in Indonesia in general. You will have all these presentations in Google Drive after we finish this side event. So without further ado, I would like to give the opportunity for Ibu Yun Insiani to deliver her video remarks. Ibu Yun Insiani is the lead expert of the Director General for Solid Waste, Hazardous Substances and Hazardous Waste of the Minister of Environment and Forestry. Formerly, she was the Director for Hazardous Substances and the focal point of Minamata Convention. So Krishna, please play the video message of Ibu Yun. Thank you.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are, I hope you are in good health. On behalf of Director General of Solid Waste Management, Hazardous Waste and Hazardous Substances Management, let me express sincere thanks and appreciation to the Secretariat of COP4 Minamata Convention, who have arranged various side events to inform delegates about different aspects relevant to the meeting in Bali. Appreciation also goes to Nexus 3 Foundation and Biodiversity Research Institute and their donor, the US Department of State for organizing this side event. As a party to Minamata Convention, since 2017, Indonesia has issued a law followed by several policies and regulations to implement our commitment to reduce and eliminate mercury. The ASGM sector is the largest single source of mercury emission in Indonesia. More than 50% of the national mercury emission come from this sector. Therefore, Indonesia committed to eliminate 100% mercury use in 180 ASGM sites by 2025. To achieve that goal, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, as the focal point of the Minamata Convention, works closely with the relevant ministries and organizations, such as the Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Ministry of Health, National Research and Innovation Agency, UN agency, and NGOs. The Presidential Decree number 21, year 2019, concerning on National Action Plan on Reduction and Elimination of Mercury set the target to eliminate until 2025. The updated regulation issued by the Minister of Trade number 7, year 2022, prohibit the importation of mercury and use in mining sector. In 2020, Indonesia has already reduced 12,448 kilograms of mercury in ASGM sector. The National Police also already confiscated about 35 tons of mercury, and the temporary storage of confiscated mercury is currently under review. Ladies and gentlemen, the responsibility to reduce and eliminate mercury in Indonesia is not only belong to the national agencies based on the Presidential Decree number 21, year 2019, the provincial and local government also have to develop local action plan to support the national targets. To implement the national action plan, we cannot do this by ourselves. Currently, with the support from UNDP Gold Project, we have already developed 6 local action plans in West Nusa Tenggara Province, Yogyakarta Province, North Sulawesi Province, Gorontalo Province, Riau Province, Maluku Province, and also with the support of Nexus 3 and BRI, 4 more local action plans are currently under the process and taking place in North Sumatra Province, West Kalimantan Province, and Southeast Sulawesi Province. Lastly, to monitor the impact of mercury pollution in the environment and how effective we have implemented our plan, we need to measure several parameters, including biomarkers in human body. Last year, we have inaugurated a Mercury Research Center coordinated under the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. This center will play an important role as to support the Indonesian laboratories' capacity in measurement mercury in the environment. We welcome all donors, NGOs, and researchers who contribute in advancing the mercury reduction, elimination, and monitoring in Indonesia. I wish you have a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Yun. Yeah, next. Yeah, so the next speaker, I would like to invite my colleague, Dia Paramita, or Mita, a legal researcher from the Center for Regulations Policy.
Jim, it's back on.
I'm sorry. Dave, mute, please. Yeah, so I would like to invite Mita to share her presentation. Mita is an environmental lawyer, and she's been working on Mercury issues since 2012. Mita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mbak Yuyun. I hope you can hear me. Yes. Everyone for joining us. So I would like to share Indonesia Mercury trade and supply issues based on our project. Yes. Next is. Yes. So status of mercury supply and trade in Indonesia based on our finding right now is that Indonesia has a primary mercury or cinnabar mining located in several different locations, and as you know that cinnabar is the origin form of mercury. So it's a rock that and in order to produce the mercury, we process it, and then with the intense, then mercury will be formed from that process. So yeah, it's very unfortunate that we actually produce significant amount of mercury, and then also that the mercury is still also widely used in ASGM in Indonesia, although it's illegally, silently. And then also the illegal trade and distribution of mercury is still happening until right now. They are smuggling and also distribution through online platform, or maybe, or even land face-to-face trade. And it's very interesting that if we look at the figure regarding to the top mercury exporter in 2019, several countries such as UAE, India, and Malaysia were the top exporter of mercury in 2019. While in this project, we studied the court order within the range of 2017 and 2019, we found out that there were criminal cases that were where the mercury trader were caught by the police, and then they intended to sell several significant amount of mercury to UAE and India. And also, like in 2020, it is just recently, India, UAE, Mexico, Japan, and Hong Kong, they were also a top producer of mercury. So the smuggling is a very interesting cases based of our finding on the regarding to the study on the court cases document. Because although Indonesia figure is not necessarily recorded as a biggest exporter or trader, but there is a clue that we may supply this the mercury to the other countries. Yeah. Next. And these are the pictures of cinnabar mining in Seram Island, and also the e-commerce platform that sell mercury. This is my personal documentation. I checked this 2 days ago, and still it's happening. The mercury being openly sold in online platform. Next. Yeah, so the challenges regarding to the mercury trade and supply based on our project, first is that in Indonesia, mercury is not necessarily a prohibited substance. It can be imported as long as it is not for mining and cosmetic industrial purposes, and it can be exported. It depends on the terms or the requirement of the country of destination. So, but Indonesia, there is no restriction for Indonesia to export mercury. And then second, that mercury is not listed as prohibited substance to be traded under LARTAS. LARTAS is Indonesian specific system it is a policy regarding to the prohibition and restriction of goods that is coming and going. If the HS is registered under LARTA's policy, then the custom usually get an alert. So the problem at the current situation is because Mercury is not listed under LARTAS. So when the custom find out that there is importation of the mercury, then they need to see whether, oh, this is for mining purpose or for cosmetic industrial purpose. If it is not, then okay, it can go inside the country. And also, like, there is no check and accountability mechanism whether the final destination of the imported mercury will be used for non-mining activities or non-mining activities. So basically, custom right now only depend on the document, whether it is requested or this is imported for non-mining purpose or not, like that. And then the third is that the mercury trade through online platform or e-commerce is not yet regulated. So I think this is something that is very urgent to be addressed by law enforcer and also the online platforms. And then also that the policy for passing out of mercury in product is partial. So, and this also influenced the importation of mercury as well, because, for example, the mercury for lamps industry is not really prohibited. And also in Indonesia, there is no clear policy about the phase out of mercury in lamps. There is no clear deadline. How are we going to reach that point, the phase out, the really elimination? So then it's somehow confuse the law enforcement and the plan for phasing out or for elimination of mercury. And the challenges regarding the law enforcement is that because possessing mercury is not necessarily a crime, so it has to be proven in the court, and the source as mercury must be proven to be from criminal activities, and it is a long process. And this is one of the reasons sometimes the law enforcer is a bit reluctant to follow up this case, because a long process and need a lot of resources. Although, in my opinion, this is not a reason for them for not handle this case. And then second is that the law enforcement is still focused on small players and not capturing the mastermind. What I meant with this statement is that law enforcement is only target the the actor in the field, but not really analyzing the whole pictures or the several different cases. Because if we look at several different cases, then we can see there are several names repeated, there are several actors, there are same actors that are involved in different cases, and maybe at the end it will lead to a big player, but rather than doing that, the law enforcement is just focused on the small player that is easy target. And the third is that there is a need to identify safe method to store confiscated mercury and the withdrawal of mercury from the market. As Ibu Yun said in her video, her video, she said that there were at least 35 tons of mercury confiscated. But unfortunately, that not so many law enforcement know how to deal with this confiscated mercury safely and properly, because it's very harmful if it's spill or if it's contaminate the environment. And the rest is that the guidance is needed to implement court orders regarding the destruction and or the disposal of mercury. This is also a specific case of Indonesia, because when the judge in the court issue a court order, they will say that, okay, the mercury that are confiscated need to be destroyed or to be disposed. But most of the time, the law enforcer will be confused to execute this order because the mercury cannot be destroyed. It should be properly treated, so then it does not contaminate the environment, it doesn't harm the people, and also the nature of the properties, the harmful properties of the mercury is disappear or neutralize. So I think this is a big issue right now. Yeah, thank you. I think this is it's my presentation, and this you can see that this is a picture of cinnabar miners in Indonesia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mita. It's very interesting closure. I hope participants from other country also will think about this issue about the decisions of courts for confiscated mercury. Yeah, so thank you so much, Mita. Next, I would like to invite Lee Bell, my colleague at IPEN. Lee is the IPEN POPs and Mercury advisor, and he's based in West Australia. Lee has been working on contaminated sites, on POPs and heavy metals for a number of years, and have experienced the situations by himself. So that make him an expert based on the experience, first-hand experience. Lee, the floor is yours. And sorry, I have only 7 minutes for you. Thank you.
I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. Tonight, thank you very much, and welcome everybody, and thank you for attending this particular site event. I'll be talking about multi-tier mercury storage for Indonesia, based on the issue that was brought to my attention early on, that police and other authorities that are confiscating mercury in the field need a structured storage process to allow them to avoid exposure themselves, but also to prevent spills, accidents, and environmental contamination. So next slide, please. The objective is to propose a sustainable system of mercury and cinnabar storage and potential disposal options for Indonesia. As we've heard, there's widespread illicit import and trade in mercury for ASGM, as well as cinnabar mining and mercury production. Other challenges include no current interim storage that meets full environmentally sound management. There's no elemental mercury waste treatment and stabilization facility or disposal facility for high strength elemental mercury. And also there's a need to develop sustainable financing for all forms of mercury storage in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Environmentally sound storage of mercury reduces overall environmental contamination and human exposure. It reduces specific exposure to authorities such as police, provides a safe and secure destination for confiscated mercury, and it also reduces exposure to medical workers and others who are phasing out mercury-containing devices. It assists the national inventory and stockpile reporting and facilitates the establishment of mercury treatment and stabilization infrastructure. Next slide, please. So, there are 3 tiers that are conceptually being developed, 3 tiers of storage. The first tier is the highest standard final disposal storage, and ultimately this is for elemental mercury. It would also include a treatment facility that can stabilize mercury, converting it into mercury sulfide or cinnabar to prevent it from being pilfered or leaking back into the ASGM market. Once it's treated as mercury sulfide, it's much more difficult to access it as elemental mercury, and it has to go through a thermal treatment process to try and produce mercury. So it's a way of keeping it from being diverted back into ASGM. A tier 1 storage facility should incorporate a treatment processing plant if possible, and either above ground or below ground storage, depending on what's suitable geographically. Next slide, please. This is just some pictorial examples of a surface or above ground long-term storage for elemental mercury based on the US Hawthorne Air Base, where they store US mercury supplies. Next slide, please. And this is an example of an Australian subsurface long-term storage for stabilised mercury and cinnabar. It's effectively an excavation into the ground in a stable geographical area with an inflated dome overhead to prevent any dust or vapour releases. But the mercury stored there is in the cinnabar or mercury sulfide form that you see on the red powdery material on the other side of the screen. Next slide, please. So tier 2 storage would be multiple, say 3 to 5 environmentally soundly managed interim storage facilities located on major Indonesian islands with ASGM activity. And they would need to meet high safety and security standards, storing up to 10 tons of elemental mercury and possibly more in each facility. And they have staff that are trained, and this is very important, trained safely in decanting and repacking and storing mercury removed from the field, confiscated illegal shipments and so on. And once it's packed and that it's safe to move and it's in UN certified packaging, it can be either exported for treatment or sent to the tier 1 facility once that's developed. Tier 2 facilities act as staging points to consolidate and pack bulk mercury for freight, either through scenario 1 to a tier 1 facility or through scenario 2 for export for disposal. Next slide, please. These are just examples of the sorts of containers and the sorts of facilities you would see for tier 2 interim storage with trained staff and protective equipment and security and so on. Next slide, please. So tier 3 storage is really small to medium dangerous goods storage cabinets. And there may be the need for dozens or even several hundred of these, depending on the ASGM activity and the amount of mercury being removed from the field. These storage units come in various sizes, and they're really to be deployed for police, for medical facilities who are phasing out mercury medical equipment, and for any other authorities who directly remove and handle mercury. The objective is to provide short-term storage that minimises exposure risk to personnel until the mercury is collected by contractors and moved on. Because a lot of material might be in poor packaging or plastic water bottles from mining sites and can be very dangerous if it's stored in police offices or in their cars or so on. So this is the sort of small-scale storage that they need before contractors pick it up. And once it has been picked up, it can be taken to the tier 2 interim storage facilities for repacking and consolidation. Next slide, please. And dangerous goods containers or lockers come in multiple sizes, so they could fit any of the scenarios you might expect to find, from a small police outpost up to a larger hospital facility that needs to store a large amount of equipment, and they can be kept secure and mostly outside of the actual facility itself to avoid the risk of vapors and so on. Next slide, please. So under 2 implementation scenarios, scenario 1 would involve a single national mercury storage and stabilisation facility that can stabilise the mercury. The tier 1 facility accepts mercury from tier 2 interim storage, and the tier 2 storage accepts mercury from the small dangerous goods lockers that are held by police and other authorities. And the ultimate objective here is that all mercury is transferred to the tier 1 facility eventually for ultimate disposal. Next slide, please. This is how it would look in terms of a schematic with lots of small collection points feeding into the tier 2 facilities, and the tier 2 facilities repacking and sending theirs ultimately to the tier 1 storage and disposal site. Next slide, please. In a geographic sense, it would look something like this. These are not chosen locations. They just correspond roughly with the study points of this project. And you would see that this is the tier 2 interim storage facilities in yellow, and the yellow arrows feed into a long-term mercury storage facility, which may be situated more centrally within the Indonesian archipelago, and preferably next to a mercury recovery and stabilization plant. Next slide, please. And under scenario 2, only the interim storage and export occurs. So it would only have the tier 3 storage locker dangerous goods and the tier 2 repacking and decanting facilities that would allow them to package the material to be sent overseas for final disposal. And this is something that would allow a staged approach whereby it could be implemented at stage tier 3 and tier 2, while the more, I guess, expensive and complex development of a tier 1 facility takes place over a period of time. Next slide, please. And under scenario 2, it would look more like this, where multiple dangerous goods locker storage feed into the interim storage tier 2 facilities, and finally, they are sent for export. Next slide, please. And thank you for your attention. And I hope I've managed to contain it within 7 to 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yes, 1 minute more. Okay, thank you so much, Lee. So I hope participants also start thinking about question. And if you put your questions, please put it in the Q&A. You can see under your chat. Or if you want, you can also type the topic of your questions during question and answer later. Okay, so to understand how effective the eliminations and the reductions of mercury monitoring is needed. And for this, I would like to invite my colleague, Dave Evers from Biodiversity Research Institute. Dave is the Executive Director and also the Chief Scientist of BRI, and also one of the expert members of UNEP panel on the effectiveness evaluation of mercury and global mercury monitoring. Dave, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yun. We're fortunate to have the resources now from the World Bank and the U.S. State Department to actually look at mercury in the environment. And thanks to the local partners, Nexus 3, some information has been gathered and more will be gathered in the future. And so this presentation is primarily about data that were generated through the World Bank project. And I was assisted by my colleague, Tim Tier. Next slide. This mercury monitoring in Indonesia follows a greater effort by the Minamata Convention to evaluate the effectiveness of the convention. There are already reports and guidelines that are being proposed to monitor mercury around the world, and the Indonesian sort of case study fits into that. So in this schematic, there's 3 compartments that the EE group is engaging in and will be deciding at the meeting in Bali in a couple of weeks. And those 3 compartments are air, biota, and humans. But that does not mean that some countries may want to look at other compartments such as sediment, soil, and water. And what we want to look in Indonesia in the end, is our plan, is to look at how mercury impacts people, how it impacts rare high trophic global species that may be listed, red listed from the IUCN process, and also commercial and economic species of interest. Next slide. And so from a human standpoint and how we look at exposure to human, there's really 2 forks in the road. There's one is an occupational hazard from ASGM activities, and there's also a dietary exposure from ASGM activities. The occupational side looks at biomarkers such as urine, because it's an inorganic elemental sort of form of mercury. And the dietary side looks at methylmercury, and that's best looked at in keratin materials such as hair. Next slide. And so to give a little bit of a background on ASGM activities and their impact in Indonesia and how it relates to the world, on the left side are the global emissions of mercury. And we all know that ASGM activities have the highest impact or input of mercury emitted through the air and the water. And we can see on the right side the Indonesia emissions and how they fit. On the left side, it's around 20% of the emissions from ASGM come from Indonesia alone. So Indonesia has a very strong footprint or global signature, and especially a local signature, and it's a very important sort of source of mercury to tackle in the country. Next slide. And so when we started looking at the impacts of mercury being released into the environment, either through the air or into the water and the landscape, there's many different ways of looking at this through abiotic, biotic, and human endpoints. And those endpoints are important to look at collectively. And so when we look at it from a biotic standpoint or human standpoint, there are different matrices that we want to look at. So a biotic standpoint are fish, abiotic, water, soil, and sediment, air. And then from a human standpoint, blood, hair, and urine are three common endpoints to use. And if we look at this chart, there is the black dashed line that anything below that is safe. Anything above that to the tan dashed line is 1 to 10 times higher than the threshold of acceptance. Anything above that tan dashed line is 10 times or higher above the threshold. Next slide. And so when we actually look at the data that were collected through the World Bank project, and these data were collected by, samples are collected by Nexus 3, there's different categories that we can look at here through ASGM direct activities, or ASGM indirect would be primarily people that may be downstream eating fish. They're not directly in the ASGM activities or the communities, or they don't directly mine, but they are impacted by that footprint of mining. And if we look at the different endpoints from hair to urine to blood and look at the bottom at all biomarkers, there's direct impact from ASGM on the human communities, and that impact is substantial. So 3/4 of the population are impacted above that threshold that I showed you. And that threshold relates to all those different compartments or endpoints, as you recall. And the indirect, even people that are not engaged directly in ASGM activities, are still impacted by that footprint of ASGM. Next. Also, if we look at hair samples in Indonesia as a population, we have 372 hair samples. And if we compare that across different regions in the world, we also use 1 part per million as our threshold. Is a very common way of looking at mercury. Below that is safe. Above that may be risky. It may be because it just depends on a lot of different factors, but it starts becoming above that threshold. And we can see in Indonesia that 70% of the individuals that were sampled within the country were above that 1 part per million threshold. Oceania had a higher level percentage of the population, and most of Oceania island communities that we work with are eating fish every day. So they are also very exposed, and we can see in the rest of the world how that exposure level relates. But we could see that Indonesia indeed has a high impact level. Next. Next slide, please. And if we look at just the biota, next slide. I want to focus now a little bit on fish. Next slide. The fish samples that were gathered to date are a very small sample size. It's a sample size of around 45 fish. When looking at fish as an endpoint, it needs to be looked at from a marine standpoint, which is in blue, or freshwater standpoint, which is in green. The different dotted lines mean different thresholds to different parts of a population of people. For example, the sensitive populations of a community are children and pregnant women, and they have a different relationship with mercury than, let's say, others. And that's why different thresholds may be needed, and different thresholds are used by different policies for different governments too. So looking at fish in Indonesia, there's still a signal that shows that there's some individual fish or fish species that are well above the exposure thresholds that we need to be concerned about. Next slide. This is Matt. Yeah. So in summary, I think we're fortunate again to have the resources to pull together the sampling effort by Nexus 3 to generate some of these data, because those data are hard fought and are complex. But the data sets so far show that the relationship of mercury and people in the environment indeed matches the high levels of mercury being released into the environment that we see from ASGM sources, and how those ASGM sources compare with the world. The next steps that we are planning to conduct, and those next steps are primarily with our U.S. State Department project that all of us are working on within this presentation, are to look at mercury biomonitoring in a greater way, because the fish samples to date are not representative of the areas and the species that we wanted to look at. So more work needs to be conducted there. We want to build from the existing World Bank data sets, and there's other data sets that the Indonesian government and Nexus 3 have gathered, so we're pulling all those together. And then while working with the Indonesian government, they have developed a new lab on mercury analysis and abilities within the country, and to help build that capacity and ideally structure long-term standardized monitoring efforts in the country of Indonesia with the Minamata Convention's interests of effectiveness evaluation. And lastly, I just want to mention there's many different resources that are available on these websites here. Some of them can consolidate the data that I just presented. And if there's any questions, I can answer them through my email address. So thank you, Union.
Thank you so much, Dave. So I hope participants receive more information about the situation in Indonesia. And thank you all to the speakers for being on time. So I would like to give you the opportunity for question and answer now. I've seen one question in a Q&A. That's from Kenjiro, Black Forest Solutions GmbH. The question is, kindly clarify if Indonesia has a national mercury inventory. If not, can you please identify the challenges? Yes, Indonesia has conducted several times mercury inventory, level 1 and level 2. The latest report was conducted by the BCRC Southeast Asia, and under the support of MIA, Minamata Initial Assessment. However, the report has not been issued yet. I'm not sure whether we can find it online, but I think it will be available soon. In 2012, we also conducted the mercury inventory using the previous version of the inventory toolkit provided by UNEP. The report of Mercury Inventory 2012 is available online on our website. My colleague will type on the chat the website of Nexus 3. Yeah, so that's, and the challenge is the input factor and the data of the sources, because there is no reliable data. So when we conducted the mercury inventory in 2012, we have to sit 3 rounds of consultations to be able to identify the correct numbers or the correct volumes or input factors. Yeah, so database is the challenge and recording of activities. Okay, so next question is from someone who's asking for the clarification for Mita. Mita, there's a question for you. What is the classification of confiscated mercury in Indonesia? Is it considered waste or product in the hands of confiscating authority? Also, regarding e-commerce, are they involved in domestic only trade or international exports?
Yes, so yeah, thank you so much for the question, Richard. Yeah, so the there is no like formal status about the classification of the confiscated mercury in the hand of the law enforcer, but it is understood that it is as a hazardous waste or hazardous substance rather than product. So then the next question is what to do with that, like whether this to treat it or what to do with this. But I think there is no confusion about the status because it's not product. They understand that it's more about the waste or hazardous substance like that. And for the online trading, mostly it's happened in domestic. So this is that we found at the present because it's easier. We have so the interesting feature of Indonesian online marketplace is that in delivery of the product that we bought from the national marketplace, they can deliver it with Grab, like with the car or with the post or national post or private post. So then the trader will have an option to with like with the Grab or with the a car like that to prevent the declaration, because if you send it via post and especially private post, you need to declare that it is not dangerous goods, and sometimes they want to check if the person is careful, the officer at the postal office is careful, normally they will check. But most of the time, if in Indonesia, we also have different, like private postal service that sometimes they don't really aware of the dangerous goods declaration, then it just can be easily packaged and sent via postal. Although based on our national law, it is prohibited to send hazardous goods via postal service. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mita. About the follow-up question is about the ownership, Mita.
Oh, the ownership?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's considered the owner of the confiscated material. Does the government assume ownership of the confiscated materials?
Oh, yeah. So the confiscated mercury, it will be depend on whether if it is proven as a criminal violation or not. If it is only administrative, it's only violate administrative provision, then it is the owner that has to be responsible. Then it is not belong to the government. But if it's considered as a criminal, as a crime, then the government will be responsible, like will take the ownership of the mercury.
Confiscated mercury.
Yeah, the confiscated mercury. Yeah.
Yeah. So the challenge is to identify whether the confiscated mercury is a crime or not.
Yes.
And who will define it as a crime or not? The police or?
It will be the court order, because if the decision whether this is a criminal act or not after the test in the court, like the police, we have to prove that this is a criminal act, and then the lawyer of the defendant will say no, this is not a criminal act, or like then at the end when the court say this is a criminal act and you have the person involved have to be sent to jail, then the government take ownership of the confiscated mercury and destroy. I mean, like not destroy, but treat it, like process it properly. Yeah, but it's long process. That's why the law enforcers sometimes reluctant to process this. Yeah, I don't know in other country. Maybe I don't know. It's an interesting case to know the comparison with IPEN. Maybe. Yeah.
What other participants thought about this. Okay, so thank you, Mita, for answering. Do we have another question? If it's not, I'm going to ask. Okay, Lee, can you please add to the explanations about the confiscated mercury and how it has to be stored, because Indonesia is an earthquake prone country and tsunami prone country. So probably the specific criteria for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you know, is it the same or could be different? And what is the business model for this?
Yes, well, the second part's probably a more complex question, but there are siting criteria that would need to be applied, particularly for tier 1, for the high-level storage, for long-term storage. And that would have to look at seismic activity, potential for flooding, and also for storm surge, those sorts of things. There's a long list. And we shouldn't forget the social element either. There needs to be due consideration of where these facilities are sited in case of an accident, fire, and explosion, and the impact that would have on the local populations. Even you take all the precautions that you possibly can, these things can still happen. A plane could crash on the facility. Anything could happen. So you have to take all of that into account when you're determining what the siting criteria are and what the sort of location might be. The difficulty with Indonesia is the seismic activity is widespread. It will make it difficult to site a tier 1 facility, but that would be if you're looking to store elemental mercury in elemental form. If you convert it to mercury sulfide, a lot of the problems are removed because it's not as mobile. It doesn't have the same sorts of impact on humans or the environment, and it doesn't release vapors in the same way under most circumstances. So to my way of looking at it, the essential thing is to develop a mercury treatment plant and to convert elemental mercury to mercury sulfide as soon as possible, or to other stabilized forms like polymers that have been developed as well. And in some cases, they're even better. Sustainably financing this kind of storage is a little bit more difficult. I would just say that for tier 2 storage, they would have to have very similar rules to tier 1 storage for siting, because the mercury there will be in elemental form. It's unavoidable. Not for tier 3 storage, it doesn't apply. It would have to be at the medical center or the police station or whatever the case may be. But for the tier 2 storage, where they're going to be storing medium quantities of elemental mercury, they would have to have strict siting criteria as well. To finance these kind of operations is not necessarily an easy task, and you would need to look towards, I think, the government having to subsidize this in part. However, with a tier 1 storage and treatment facility, there are other industries in Indonesia that generate mercury waste byproduct. And currently, most of that is exported for treatment overseas. It would make much more sense economically to treat it in Indonesia, and the commercial rates of treatment of this type of waste could help offset dealing with material that's been confiscated and is held as waste product post-criminal investigation. So there would need to be a balance there where industrial waste generators like the oil and gas sector and others in a sense help subsidize the treatment and storage cost of that orphan mercury that comes out of the court process. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Lee. So yeah, the question about financing the confiscated mercury and then its processing and storage is the challenge for everyone. I guess after the Minamata Convention now entering so now the 5th year of the implementation after it's ratified. And many products and processes now already phased out and eliminated. I think it's time to talk about storage. Yeah, so thank you so much, Lee. So is there any question from the audience? No, okay. I would like to continue the question to Dave. Dave, so could you please tell us about the mechanism of global mercury monitoring and what is the role of the regional monitoring hubs or significant countries like in Indonesia, in the mercury global monitoring?
Sure, Union. Yes, I think there's many different challenges of monitoring mercury in a standardized way so we can compare the results and findings across the board. And there's more places to monitor mercury than there are resources generally. So how best to consolidate the resources and make the most of them? One way may be to develop regional hubs and develop regional capacity and expertise by certain countries that want to take a leadership role. And with that leadership role and laboratory abilities, they can work within the region. Those countries can work with other countries, neighboring countries in the region, and build that capacity and network that can go far and can be long lasting and can provide those long-term sort of monitoring needs that we all really require for the Minamata Convention. We're fortunate that the SIP program through the Secretariat's office has provided some of those funds to kind of start that process. One such project exists in the Caribbean with Antigua and Barbuda as the focal lead for that region. A second region that has been recently funded is in Gabon to start up a more of a Central African sort of regional hub. And then there's interest in generating maybe more of these regional hubs, either in a formal way or informal way. There's, for example, several different organizations that are working together with governments in Northwest South America, in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. And then there's also interest in Indonesia. Indonesia has the Mercury lab capacity, has the problem in its country, as we saw from the presentation I gave. And there are likely other areas, other countries within the region around Indonesia that also face these challenges of how much mercury is in the environment, how can that impact eco-health and human health. And to get at that, those countries probably need some sort of structure within the region. And I do think Indonesia could be also one of those countries that could provide that hub. So that's one approach and one idea that I would say is worthwhile.
Okay, thank you. Just last question for Dave. Just a quick one. Dave, how can we use the data from biomarkers, especially biomarkers data, link it up with the health strategy? Because at the moment, all projects are focusing on industrial approaches and so on, like coal-fired power plants, cement kiln, and then products, lamps. What about linking up the monitoring of biomarkers with health program?
Yes,
is there any future for that?
Is there any future? I hope there's a great future for that. I think some countries are maybe more ahead than others, and I think there maybe in some ways there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. I think there are some countries that have spent a lot of time on how much mercury is too much from a human health standpoint. And there are ways to manage mercury from a dietary standpoint or occupational standpoint getting into our bodies. It's not an either or switch on or off. I think there's many different ways of managing that mercury in our food resources, for example. So I think it's engaging the health ministries and looking at how can they use examples that are already in place in some of the developed countries.
All right. Okay. I hope the Indonesian government and stakeholders will do a quick plan, because we have to catch up with a lot of things about health issues. We have enough data about mercury in the environment and the food chain. So now we have to support the Ministry of Health to develop a vigorous strategy. Okay, so for the closing, thank you so much for everyone who participated in this call. I don't know if Lee would like to say something about the upcoming webinar of IPEN side event. and Dave as well. When is it your side event? So probably you want to announce here, please.
Yes, so there is a IPEN webinar on contaminated sites from Minamata to Indonesia and Bolivia that will be held on Wednesday at 6 p.m. Perth time, and I can't calculate it for everybody, but it's on the it's on the COP4 website under this online site event section. And so if anybody has an interest in contaminated site issues, we'd welcome you to join that particular site event on Wednesday, 6 p.m. Perth, Western Australian time, and whatever that might work out wherever you happen to be tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Dave?
Sure, and there is a side event that really delves into some of these mercury monitoring issues, and there are many different presenters from around the world that will be presenting on their mercury monitoring efforts in their different countries. Our side event on mercury monitoring is on Thursday at 12:30 to 13:30 CET or Geneva time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much for Mita, Lee, Dave, and also Eric and Carmen for translating. I hope the participants have their benefits of translations. And thank you for the BRI team that have provided support for the preparations of the materials. And also thanks to the Minamata Secretariat, Richard, Shariful, Pablo. Thank you so much for your support. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Terima kasih, Bu. Thank
See
you,
you.
everyone.
Bye.